Something is coming. And most people have absolutely no idea it's already in motion. Right now, as you're watching this, a storm system is quietly organizing itself, pulling energy from places that should not be producing this kind of power in July. And what it's about to do over the next several days is going to catch millions of people completely off guard. This is not a normal July storm. This is not the kind of thing that comes around every few years. What we are tracking right now is something that meteorologists are already calling rare. And when scientists use that word, you need to pay attention, because they don't use it lightly. So stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what is happening, why it matters, where it's going to hit the hardest, and what the next 7 to 10 days are going to look like for a massive portion of the country. This one is serious. Let's get into it. To understand why this storm is so unusual, you first need to understand what July is supposed to look like atmospherically. July is traditionally dominated by high pressure. It's the peak of summer in the northern hemisphere, which means the jet stream is pushed far to the north, storm tracks are suppressed, and the kind of deep, organized low-pressure systems that you see in autumn and winter simply don't have the atmospheric environment they need to develop. That's just the way July works. Heat dominates. Moisture sits. Thunderstorms fire up in the afternoon and fall apart by evening. That is the normal cycle. That is what's supposed to happen. But right now, something has gone very wrong with that pattern, and the result is a storm system that looks like it belongs in October, not July. The jet stream has buckled in a way that is highly unusual for this time of year. There's a deep trough of low pressure digging into a region that almost never sees this kind of atmospheric forcing in the middle of summer, and the energy feeding into the system is not just coming from one source. It's being pulled from multiple directions simultaneously, and that combination is what makes this storm so dangerous and so rare. Let's talk about where this energy is coming from, because this is where things get really interesting. The first source is a pool of unusually cold air that has been trapped in the upper atmosphere over a region that should be experiencing warm summer conditions. This cold air aloft is acting like a fuel reservoir. As the low-pressure system deepens, it's tapping into that cold pool and using it to drive rapid intensification. The second source of energy is the moisture. July does bring humidity, especially across the central and eastern parts of the country, and that moisture is being drawn into the system in enormous quantities. When you combine cold air aloft with massive amounts of low-level moisture, the atmosphere becomes incredibly unstable. You get explosive storm development, you get severe weather, you get wind events that feel completely out of place for the season. And the third energy source is the temperature gradient. Right now, there's an unusually sharp boundary between a blistering heat dome sitting over one part of the country and the cold system pushing in from another direction. That temperature contrast is acting like a slingshot, accelerating the storm's development and giving it a punch that typical July systems simply don't have. All three of these energy sources are feeding into the same system at the same time. And that is why this is not a storm you can afford to ignore. Now let's talk about timing, because timing with a storm like this is everything. The system has been developing over the past several days, but the real intensification window is coming. The models have been remarkably consistent in showing a period of rapid deepening, and when you see that kind of model agreement this far out, it tells you something significant is locked in. The atmosphere has already committed to this pattern. The question at this point is not whether this storm is going to be powerful. The question is exactly how powerful it gets, and which areas end up on the wrong side of it. Because with a storm like this, location relative to the low-pressure center is absolutely critical. The areas that end up on the eastern and northern flanks of the system are going to experience something very different from the areas on the western side. Wind directions, precipitation types, and intensity all shift dramatically depending on exactly where the storm tracks. And right now, the models are showing a track that puts several heavily populated areas directly in the zone of maximum impact. The wind threat from the system is something that needs to be discussed in detail because it's going to be one of the most significant impacts and one of the most surprising aspects of this storm for people who aren't tracking it closely. We are not talking about typical summer thunderstorm winds that gust to 40 or 50 miles per hour and then calm down. We are talking about a sustained, organized wind event driven by the pressure gradient of a deep, low-pressure system. When a storm of this depth moves through an area, the pressure gradient between the low center and the surrounding atmosphere creates a wind machine that can produce gusts well exceeding what most people associate with a July weather event. Trees that are in full leaf right now, which means they have enormous surface area catching the wind, are going to be extremely vulnerable. Power infrastructure that may not have been tested by a serious storm in months is going to face a significant challenge. And because this is July, not November, many people simply won't be mentally prepared for the kind of wind event that's coming. They'll look outside, see summer, and not take the threat seriously until it's already on top of them. That is a dangerous combination. The rain threat is equally significant. The moisture content of this storm is exceptional for July. And the training thunderstorm pattern that's likely to set up on the southeastern side of the system could produce rainfall totals that are genuinely stunning. When you have a slow-moving or nearly stationary area of convection repeatedly firing over the same geographic region, pulling from a deeply moist atmosphere, the rainfall accumulations can pile up faster than drainage systems can handle. We're talking about areas that could see several inches of rain in a matter of hours. And in some locations, the totals over the full event period could be extraordinary. Flash flooding is going to be one of the primary dangers from this storm, and it's important to understand that flash flooding kills more people in the United States every single year than any other weather phenomenon. More than tornadoes, more than hurricanes, more than lightning. It is relentless and it is unforgiving, and when a July storm of this magnitude trains its heaviest precipitation over an area, the flooding response can be terrifyingly fast. Let's talk about the severe weather component, because this storm also has a significant severe weather threat embedded within it. And this is another aspect that makes it unusual for July. Normally, July severe weather is driven by daytime heating. You get hot afternoons, the atmosphere destabilizes, you get isolated severe thunderstorms that fire up in the heat of the day and then weaken overnight. That is the typical summer severe weather pattern. But this storm is different. Because of the strong forcing mechanism associated with the deep low-pressure system, the severe weather potential is not dependent on daytime heating alone. This system has enough large-scale forcing to produce severe storms even at night, even in areas where the surface temperatures are not particularly extreme. That means the overnight hours, when people are asleep and their guard is down, carry a real severe weather risk. Hail is expected. Damaging straight-line winds embedded in squall lines are expected. And in the warm sector of this storm, where the atmospheric ingredients come together in exactly the right way, there is a tornado threat that absolutely cannot be dismissed. Now, I want to take a moment to address something that you may have already been thinking about. You might be wondering how a storm this powerful can develop in July. You might be thinking that this sounds exaggerated, that storms this intense belong to other seasons. And that is exactly the point. The fact that this is happening in July is precisely what makes it so dangerous and so noteworthy. Our infrastructure, our emergency response systems, our individual level of preparedness, all of it is calibrated for summer weather. People have summer mindsets. They're not thinking about powerful storms. They're thinking about vacations and backyard barbecues and weekend plans. And then something like this comes along and completely blindsides the population that isn't paying attention. The people who are watching this video right now, who understand what's coming, are already miles ahead of the majority of the population in terms of awareness and preparation. But awareness is only the first step. You also need to understand the geographic specifics of where this storm is going to hit the hardest. The track of this system is going to determine everything. Based on the current model consensus, the storm center is expected to move through a corridor that puts a specific set of regions in the highest impact zone. The areas along and north of the track are going to see the most intense winds. The areas south and southeast of the track are going to see the heaviest rainfall and the most significant flooding. The transition zone between these two areas, what meteorologists call the dry line or the warm sector boundary depending on the region, is where the severe convective threat will be maximized. This is where the atmosphere will be simultaneously loaded with moisture, forced upward by the approaching system, and sheared in a way that organizes storms into their most dangerous configurations. If you live in this zone, you need to be paying extremely close attention to every update over the next 48 to 72 hours, because the details of this storm are still being refined. And the difference between a storm that passes 50 miles to your north versus one that passes directly over your area can be enormous in terms of impact. One of the aspects of this storm that I find particularly alarming when I look at the data is the duration of the event. This is not going to be a storm that sweeps through quickly and moves on. The atmospheric pattern that is allowing this system to develop is also acting as a partial block to its forward motion. The storm is going to slow down. In fact, the models are showing a scenario where portions of this system essentially stall or meander for a period, and when a storm of this intensity slows down, all of the impacts get amplified. The winds persist longer, the rainfall accumulates to greater depths, the severe weather window extends over a longer period, and the people in the highest impact zones are not going to get hit once and then get relief. They are potentially going to deal with this system for an extended period. And that is an exhausting and dangerous prospect, especially for communities that rely on power, have vulnerable infrastructure, or have populations that depend on continuous services. Let's talk about what the days immediately ahead look like in terms of a timeline, because this is where the story really comes into focus, and where you need to be building your personal understanding of how this event unfolds. The early stages of the system's impact are already beginning to manifest in some areas in the form of increasing cloud cover, shifting wind patterns, and early rain bands moving ahead of the main storm center. This is the atmosphere beginning to respond to the approaching system, and it is a signal that things are about to change rapidly. As the system deepens and the pressure gradient tightens over the next 24 to 36 hours, wind speeds will begin to increase noticeably. The first round of significant weather impacts will affect the regions closest to the storm's current position, and then as the system continues to move and evolve, the swath of impacts will expand outward, potentially reaching areas that currently look quiet and calm. That false sense of calm is actually one of the biggest dangers of a storm like this. The weather right now does not reflect what is coming. The atmosphere is loading, not discharging, and when it finally does discharge, it's going to do so with remarkable speed and intensity. The agricultural implications of this storm are something that I also think deserve serious attention. July is a critical growth period for a huge variety of crops across the regions in this storm's path. Corn is at a sensitive stage of development. Soybeans are filling out. Small grains that are already harvested or in the process of being harvested are extremely vulnerable to wind damage and excessive rainfall. A storm of this magnitude, moving through the agricultural heartland in the middle of July, can cause crop damage that runs into hundreds of millions of dollars, and that damage doesn't just affect farmers. It ripples through supply chains, affects commodity prices, and ultimately shows up in grocery stores in the weeks and months ahead. This is not just a weather story. It is an economic story. And for rural communities, where farming is the foundation of the local economy, a storm like this can be genuinely devastating in ways that take years to fully recover from. The power grid vulnerability is another factor that I cannot overstate. Modern power grids are sophisticated systems, but they are designed with certain assumptions built in. One of those assumptions is that the most severe grid stress in summer comes from heat, from air conditioning load, from the demand side of the equation. What utility operators are going to be dealing with here is a supply-side disruption at the worst possible time, with extremely high demand already on the system from summer heat loads, and then a severe mechanical storm event that knocks out transmission and distribution infrastructure. When lines go down in July, the consequences are more serious than in almost any other time of year. Vulnerable populations, elderly individuals, people on medical equipment, families with young children, all of them are immediately at risk when the power goes out in extreme summer heat. Emergency cooling centers, backup generators, community resilience infrastructure, all of that is going to be tested. And based on what this storm is showing on the models right now, tested hard. I want to spend some time talking about the historical context of this storm, because placing it in context helps you understand just how unusual this situation really is. Looking back through the historical records, there are remarkably few examples of storms with this kind of depth and organization developing in July over this region. The atmosphere simply does not usually allow it. When comparable events have occurred in the past, they have consistently produced outsized impacts, precisely because populations and infrastructure are not adapted to expect this kind of forcing in the peak of summer. Some of the most dramatic and damaging storm events in certain regions have actually occurred outside of the traditional storm season, when the combination of population unpreparedness, infrastructure vulnerability, and atmospheric surprise created conditions for disaster that a similar storm in the fall or spring simply would not have produced. That historical pattern is exactly what makes the next several days so important to watch. Emergency management officials are going to be working overtime as this system approaches, and that is appropriate given what the models are showing. The challenge that they face is communicating the severity of this threat to a public that is primed for summer, not for serious storm events. Getting people to take action before the storm arrives, not after it's already on top of them, is always the central challenge in emergency management, and it is particularly acute with an out-of-season storm event like this one. If you have family or friends in the potentially affected regions, now is the time to make sure they know what's coming. Not in a way that causes panic, but in a way that ensures they are informed, that they have thought through their own preparedness, and that they know what to do if conditions deteriorate rapidly. That kind of communication, person to person, community to community, is one of the most powerful tools we have against the danger that a storm like this represents. What should you actually be doing right now if you are in the potentially affected region? First, you need to be monitoring official weather sources continuously over the next 48 to 72 hours. The details of this storm are going to continue to be refined as it approaches, and the updates from your local National Weather Service office are going to be your most valuable source of specific, localized information. Second, you need to think about your power situation. If you have a generator, make sure it is fueled and tested before the storm arrives. If you don't have a generator, make sure you have enough supplies to manage without power for at least several days, because outage restoration after an event like this, when multiple areas are impacted simultaneously, can take much longer than people expect. Third, you need to think about your outdoor environment. Anything that can become a projectile in high winds needs to be secured or brought inside. Fourth, and most importantly, you need to have a plan for flash flooding. Know where the low-lying areas near you are. Know your evacuation routes. Know that if water starts rising on a road in front of you, turning around is always the right decision. Never drive through flooded roadways. That single decision, turning around instead of driving through, has saved more lives than any other piece of storm safety advice ever given. As we move into the final days before the system reaches its peak intensity and begins to move through the affected regions, the situation is going to develop rapidly. The model data is going to sharpen. The forecasts are going to become more specific, and the atmosphere itself is going to begin sending increasingly clear signals that something significant is on the way. Watch for those signals. Watch for the wind shifting. Watch for the clouds thickening from a specific direction. Watch for the barometric pressure dropping on your home weather station or app. These are the atmosphere telling you that the storm is approaching, and they are your early warning system before the most intense impacts arrive. This is a storm that deserves your full attention over the coming days. It is rare. It is powerful. It is moving toward regions that are simply not expecting something like this in July. The combination of unusual atmospheric dynamics, multiple energy sources, significant wind and rainfall threats, a severe weather component, and a population that is largely unprepared makes this one of the more concerning weather events I have tracked this summer. Stay informed. Stay prepared. Share this information with the people around you who need to know what's coming. And keep watching, because this story is going to continue to develop over the next several days, and every update is going to matter. The storm is coming. Now you know.